Welcome to another spine-chilling investigation with the master detective himself. Today, we uncover one of London's most disturbing cases, a mystery that will make you question everything you think you know about the shadows that lurk in Victorian London. If you love mysteries that twist your mind and keep you guessing until the very last second, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what you're about to witness will leave you breathless. The fog hangs thick over Baker Street this gray morning, wrapping around gas lamps like ghostly fingers. Through the mist, a lone figure approaches number 221B, his footsteps echoing against wet cobblestones. The dawn has barely broken when Mrs. Hudson discovers the mysterious package left at our doorstep, a brown paper parcel that seems innocent enough until you notice the dark stains seeping through the wrapping. Holmes examines the package with his characteristic precision, his keen eyes immediately catching details that would escape ordinary observation. The sawdust embedded in the twine tells a story, as does the peculiar scent of anise attempting to mask something far more sinister. He strikes a match against the paper, testing for fat residue, and notes the moisture patterns that indicate this delivery arrived at exactly 5:42 in the morning. Inside the sealed meat hook wrapped in brown paper lies more than just a butcher's tool. It bears a single groove, like a tally mark, etched into the steel. But what captures Holmes's attention most is the tiny thread of teal wax hidden within the parcel's folded seam. This is no ordinary grocer's sealant, but something far more specific: funeral parlor wax. The streets of London whisper of an urban legend, a phantom known as the Butcher of Baker Street, who supposedly takes only what the living have already discarded. Holmes dismisses such superstition with his methodical mind, but even he cannot ignore the growing pattern of disappearances that have plagued the neighborhood. The mystery deepens when we realize this delivery was made by someone with keys and routine access to the building, someone who moves through London's early morning shadows with practiced ease. The question that burns in Holmes's analytical mind is not just who sent this grisly message, but why they chose to announce their presence so boldly. As rain continues to fall on the slick cobbles outside, washing the butcher paper parcels and their faint red stains into the gutters, we prepare to follow the great detective into one of his most chilling cases yet. The game, as Holmes would say, is afoot, and the stakes have never been higher. The morning brings our first visitor, Mrs. Ada Crowthorne, a widowed boarding house keeper whose hands shake as she clutches her keys. Her tenant, a junior clerk named Thomas Whitmore, vanished 3 days ago after mentioning he had found a supplier offering discount cuts of meat. Ada's voice trembles as she recounts how Thomas had been struggling financially, working extra hours just to make his modest rent. Holmes observes Ada carefully, noting the worn edges of her dress and the ink stains on her fingers from keeping meticulous records. She runs a respectable establishment, she insists, but times have been difficult since her husband's death. Thomas was a quiet tenant, always prompt with his payments, until recently when he began receiving mysterious packages in the early morning hours. Our investigation leads us to Mr. Levi North, a stoic master butcher, whose shop stands at the corner of Marylebone Street. His ledger reveals something peculiar: debts that don't align with a successful butcher's typical finances. North carries himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to hard work, a bone-handled knife charm dangling from his watch chain. His hands, scarred from years of working with blades, remain steady even under Holmes's scrutiny. The shop itself tells its own story. Hooks hang in precise rows, their surfaces gleaming despite the early hour. The sawdust on the floor matches what was found in the mysterious parcel, but Holmes notes something more: traces of anise seeds mixed within, a detail that speaks to a very specific supplier. Near the market we encounter Nell Pike, a flower seller who works the early morning shift. She's missing one glove, and her eyes dart nervously when questioned about the missing clerk. Holmes notices her careful word choices, the way she avoids mentioning specific times or locations. She claims to have seen Thomas just days ago, carrying lilies that smelled distinctly of anise, his demeanor cheerful rather than fearful. Inspector Lestrade arrives with his characteristic blend of skepticism and frustration. His ink-stained cuffs suggest long nights spent documenting cases, and the tight lines around his eyes speak to the pressure he faces from his superiors. The press has begun circulating rumors about the Butcher of Baker Street, and Lestrade needs answers before panic spreads through the city. Dr. Watson proves invaluable as always. his medical training helping him identify the significance of various clues without flinching at the more disturbing aspects of the case. The scent of camphor on his coat mingles with the sharper odors of blood and bleach that seem to follow this investigation. His steady presence provides a calming influence as we navigate between the various locations central to our inquiry. The geography of the crime reveals itself through careful observation. Baker Street Mews connects to North's shop through a narrow service alley, while a disused cold room beneath a funeral warehouse provides the third point of what appears to be a triangular route. Holmes identifies potential risks. A roofline hatch that could provide unseen access, blind spots behind stacked hogsheads in the alley, and the Thames side wharf where offal carts are routinely cleaned at dawn. Two solid leads emerge from our initial investigation. The teal wax proves consistent with mortuary seals used by funeral parlors throughout London. The sawdust, threaded with those distinctive anise seeds, can be traced to a single supplier who services both butchers and funeral establishments. But it's the transverse hint that proves most intriguing. A tram ticket stub found in the parcel's crease, timed for hours after the supposed delivery window. Time pressure mounts when we learn of an upcoming city inspection of all London abattoirs, scheduled to begin in just 48 hours. This inspection will force a complete reorganization of inventories and eliminate any trace evidence that might remain. The bureaucratic machinery of London waits for no investigation, creating an urgency that drives our every move. The first logical shock arrives when Holmes discovers an anomaly in North's financial records. Rather than profiting from selling discount cuts, the ledger shows he consistently overpaid for offcuts, a practice that contradicts every principle of successful butchery. This revelation forces us to reconsider our assumptions about both motive and opportunity. As evening approaches and gas lamps begin to flicker to life along Baker Street, Holmes assembles the evidence collected during our first day of investigation. The pattern suggests something far more complex than a simple case of disappeared meat or even ordinary murder. The careful use of funeral parlor wax, the specific timing of deliveries, and the involvement of multiple parties across London's commercial districts point to an organized operation that spans several legitimate businesses. The missing clerk, Thomas Whitmore, appears to have stumbled into something much larger than a simple opportunity to purchase cheap meat. His disappearance marks not just a personal tragedy, but a potential threat to the entire network that operates in London's shadows between the respectable worlds of commerce and death. Conflicting testimonies begin to emerge as we delve deeper into the circumstances surrounding Thomas Whitmore's disappearance. Mrs. Ada Crowthorne maintains that her tenant had grown increasingly nervous about night carts that passed through their neighborhood at unusual hours. She describes him peering through curtains in the early morning darkness, muttering about sounds that didn't belong to typical commercial traffic. However, Nell Pike's account paints an entirely different picture. When pressed for details, she describes seeing Thomas just 2 days before his disappearance, carrying a bouquet of white lilies with that distinctive anise fragrance. Far from appearing fearful, she insists he seemed almost cheerful, even whistling a popular tune as he walked toward the market district. The contradiction troubles Holmes, who recognizes that both women could be telling their version of the truth while missing crucial details. Inspector Lestrade adds another layer of complexity, with reports of anonymous tips flooding the police station. Multiple sources have pointed fingers at a rival butcher operating near Whitechapel, a man known for undercutting prices and maintaining questionable business practices. However, when Holmes examines the timing of these tips, they align too perfectly with our investigation's progress, suggesting deliberate misdirection rather than genuine concern from London's citizens. The gaps in each person's story reveal deeper currents of shame and financial anxiety. Ada's boarding house exists in a precarious balance between respectability and poverty. North's butcher shop, despite its orderly appearance, shows signs of recent financial strain. Even Nell's flower-selling operation seems to depend on customers and suppliers she's reluctant to name directly. Holmes notes the subtle signs of deception and fear that manifest in small physical details. There are brief silences when conversation approaches a closed cellar door in North's shop. Eyes consistently avoid the display of meat hooks, and fingers unconsciously steer clear of a teal-waxed envelope positioned behind the shop's till. These behavioral patterns suggest knowledge being deliberately withheld rather than simple ignorance. Technical evidence provides more concrete leads. Water samples from the drain runoff near North's shop reveal trace amounts of ammonium sulfide and sodium borate, chemicals specifically used in mortuary cleaning procedures rather than standard butcher shop sanitation. This discovery shifts our focus from traditional meat processing to the intersection between butchery and funeral services. An emotional clue emerges when Holmes discovers a pressed carnation hidden within Thomas Whitmore's personal ledger, its petals dusted with the same anise residue found throughout this case. The flower contradicts Ada's narrative of a frightened tenant, suggesting instead someone who might have been involved in a romantic relationship that others preferred to keep secret. These opposite vectors point toward a funeral mortuary pipeline, masquerading as legitimate butcher supply operations. The logistics become clearer as Holmes maps the flow of materials between funeral parlors, cold storage facilities, and retail butcher shops. Someone has created an efficient system for redirecting materials that should remain within funeral industry channels. Holmes's methodical approach reveals itself through systematic observation and testing. He times the regular cart routes through the neighborhood, noting variations in schedule and cargo. Chalk scattered along alley thresholds helps track foot traffic patterns, while careful measurement of hook heights and scrape marks on walls allows him to reconstruct the physical process used to move heavy packages. The evidence initially seems to stack neatly toward Levi North as our primary suspect. His financial difficulties provide motive, his access to butcher equipment explains the method, and his shop's location offers the perfect cover for unusual deliveries. Holmes begins building a comprehensive case that accounts for every piece of evidence we've collected. However, a crucial discovery disrupts this neat conclusion. A drain trap near the funeral warehouse yields samples of teal wax that predate North's current tenancy of the butcher shop by several months. This temporal inconsistency forces a complete reevaluation of our assumptions about when this operation began and who initiated it. The false clearing moment arrives when Holmes realizes he has been constructing a narrative that fits the evidence rather than following where the evidence actually leads. North's involvement, while possible, doesn't account for the funeral industry connections or explain the sophisticated knowledge of mortuary chemistry required to execute such a scheme. Dr. Watson observes the toll this investigation takes on everyone involved. The constant exposure to questions about death, decay, and deliberate deception wears on even the most resilient individuals. Ada's trembling increases with each interview. North's stoic facade begins showing cracks of suppressed anger, and even Lestrade's professional demeanor shows signs of strain. As night falls over London and gas lamps cast dancing shadows through the fog, Holmes acknowledges that this case requires a fundamental shift in approach. The answer lies not in the obvious connections between butcher shops and missing persons, but in the subtle relationships between London's legitimate death industry and those who would exploit its resources for profit. The investigation must now focus on funeral establishments, mortuary workers, and the complex web of regulations and customs that govern how London handles its dead. The morning brings a decisive shift in our investigation when Holmes discovers that Levi North's alibi proves absolutely unshakable. A stamped market wayslip from Smithfield shows North purchasing wholesale meat at 4:58 in the morning, with his signature clearly recorded by the market clerk. Multiple witnesses corroborate his presence during the exact time window when the mysterious package was delivered to Baker Street. North's delivery route, meticulously documented in his own hand, accounts for every minute of his morning schedule. The timestamps match perfectly with merchant receipts from 3 different locations, creating an ironclad timeline that eliminates him as a suspect in the physical delivery. Holmes examines each piece of documentation with his magnifying glass, searching for signs of forgery, but finds none. This revelation forces a complete reconsideration of our working theory. If North didn't deliver the package, then someone else has been using his shop as either a cover or a target for misdirection. The careful attention to butcher-related details in the evidence was designed to point suspicion in his direction, while the real perpetrator operated from a different sphere entirely. Holmes notes that whoever orchestrated this scheme possesses intimate knowledge of North's business practices and daily routines. The sawdust match, the timing of deliveries, and even the financial inconsistencies in North's ledger could all be explained by someone systematically manipulating his supply chain rather than North himself engaging in illegal activities. Signs of invisible antagonism begin manifesting throughout London's commercial district. Someone has been methodically bleaching specific pages in various ledgers, removing entries that might reveal patterns or connections. A pork belly order originally destined for North's shop gets mysteriously redirected to a different address, leaving him with unhappy customers and unexplained inventory gaps. Most troubling of all, Nell Pike retracts her previous statement about seeing Thomas Whitmore with the anise-scented lilies. When Holmes visits her flower stand, she appears genuinely frightened, glancing repeatedly over her shoulder and speaking in whispers. She claims she was mistaken about the dates and can no longer remember specific details about Thomas's appearance or behavior. The anonymous tips pointing toward the Whitechapel butcher suddenly make more sense as deliberate misdirection. Someone has been feeding information to multiple sources, creating a coordinated campaign to focus attention on completely innocent parties, while the real operation continues undisturbed. The sophistication of this approach suggests someone with experience in manipulation and intimate knowledge of how police investigations typically proceed. Holmes revisits the transverse clue, that tram ticket stub found in the original parcel. When examined in light of North's verified alibi, it aligns perfectly with the commute schedule of mortuary workers rather than butchers. The timing corresponds to the end of night shift duties at several funeral establishments throughout London, creating a new window for investigation. Our focus shifts to mapping the connections between London's extensive funeral industry and the legitimate meat trade. Holmes discovers that several funeral parlors maintain cold storage facilities that far exceed their typical needs for preserving bodies awaiting burial. These excess capacities could easily accommodate other types of organic material without arousing suspicion from authorities. The use of anise as a masking agent becomes more significant when we learn that it's commonly employed in funeral parlors to counteract unpleasant odors during preparation procedures. Someone with mortuary experience would naturally turn to anise when attempting to disguise the scent of decomposing organic matter, whether human or animal in origin. Holmes begins developing a new profile of our antagonist. This person possesses technical knowledge of both meat processing and mortuary science, has access to funeral industry supplies including teal wax and anise oil, and maintains enough authority or influence to manipulate business records across multiple establishments. The methodical approach to evidence destruction suggests someone comfortable with administrative procedures and record-keeping systems. The revelation that we've been pursuing the wrong suspect entirely creates a dangerous new dynamic. Our true antagonist has been observing our investigation while we focused on North, gaining valuable information about our methods and priorities. This advantage allows them to stay several steps ahead, while systematically eliminating evidence that might expose their operation. Watson notes the psychological implications of this reversal. Everyone involved in the case, Ada, North, Nell, even Lestrade, has been manipulated by someone operating with near-perfect information about their circumstances and motivations. The fear in Nell's eyes suggests she knows exactly who has been pulling these strings, but feels powerless to speak openly about it. Time pressure intensifies as we realize that our misdirection has allowed the real perpetrator additional days to consolidate their position and eliminate remaining evidence. The upcoming abattoir inspection, rather than threatening our suspects, might actually provide cover for someone wanting to reorganize funeral industry operations without scrutiny. As evening fog rolls in from the Thames, Holmes acknowledges that we face an adversary of considerable intelligence and resources. The careful orchestration of false leads, the manipulation of legitimate businesses, and the systematic intimidation of witnesses all point to someone operating from within London's established institutions rather than from its criminal underworld. The game has become far more complex than we initially realized. The revelation of North's innocence sends ripples of consequence throughout our investigation, affecting each person involved in distinctly human ways. Mrs. Ada Crowthorne, who had been so certain about her suspicions regarding unusual meat deliveries, now swings between accusation and guilt. She paces her boarding house parlor, wringing her hands as she realizes her hasty judgments may have endangered an innocent man's livelihood and reputation. Ada's transformation reveals the toll that fear and uncertainty exact on ordinary citizens. The missing rent from Thomas Whitmore already strains her finances, and now she faces the possibility that her public accusations against North might result in legal consequences. Her trembling increases as she contemplates how quickly a respectable widow can fall from marginal security into complete destitution in Victorian London's unforgiving social structure. Inspector Lestrade bristles with professional frustration at being maneuvered into pursuing false leads. His ink-stained cuffs become more pronounced as he works longer hours trying to untangle the web of misdirection that has consumed valuable police resources. The press continues demanding answers about the butcher of Baker Street, and Lestrade now faces the humiliating prospect of admitting his investigation focused on entirely innocent parties. The inspector's anger manifests in sharp questions and skeptical glances directed even at Holmes, whose reputation usually commands respect. Lestrade recognizes that someone has made fools of the Metropolitan Police, and his superiors will demand explanations that he cannot yet provide. The political implications of this case extend far beyond a simple missing person inquiry. Levi North's stoicism finally cracks under the accumulated pressure of suspicion, financial strain, and damage to his professional reputation. For the first time since we began investigating him, genuine anger breaks through his careful reserve. He speaks bitterly about customers who now avoid his shop, suppliers who question his orders, and neighbors who whisper behind his back about his possible involvement in unsavory activities. North's anger carries the particular pain of someone whose integrity has been questioned without cause. His bone-handled knife charm, once a symbol of professional pride, now feels like evidence that others interpret as sinister. The meat hooks in his shop, previously tools of an honest trade, have become objects that customers eye with suspicion and fear. Dr. Watson provides his characteristic steady presence while documenting the physical and emotional toll visible in everyone involved. He notes the fatigue lines deepening around Ada's eyes, the defensive tension in North's shoulders, and the way Nell Pike seems to shrink into herself whenever questioned. His medical training allows him to recognize symptoms of genuine stress and fear as opposed to mere inconvenience. Watson also observes callus patterns on hands and wear marks on clothing that tell stories about each person's daily labor and economic circumstances. These details help Holmes understand the pressures and motivations that make people vulnerable to manipulation by someone with greater resources and knowledge. Holmes implements a fundamental shift in investigative strategy, reprioritizing interviews to focus on funeral industry workers rather than meat trade professionals. He institutes routine observations at the funeral warehouse that houses the disused cold room, tracking the patterns of employee arrivals and departures throughout the day and night shifts. The adjustment requires delicate maneuvering to avoid alerting our true antagonist to the change in focus. Holmes maintains the appearance of continued interest in butcher shops, while quietly redirecting actual surveillance toward mortuary establishments. This deception within an investigation creates additional complexity, but may be essential for preventing further evidence destruction. Holmes sets a subtle trap by requesting teal wax for an insurance seal on some valuable documents, watching carefully to see who shows recognition or concern about this seemingly innocent request. The responses he receives help narrow the field of potential suspects while testing whether our antagonist monitors routine business interactions throughout the district. A clearer picture emerges of our likely suspect, Mr. Corbett, the mortuary foreman at Whitmore & Associates Funeral Services. His administrative responsibilities provide access to both supplies and records, while his economic circumstances suggest motivation for additional income through irregular channels. Corbett's character profile reveals administrative pride masking financial desperation, a combination that often leads to methodical, paper-trail-oriented crimes. Corbett's position grants him intimate knowledge of London's death industry operations, from embalming procedures to burial scheduling. He would understand the chemicals involved in body preservation, have routine access to teal wax and anise oil, and possess the authority to redirect materials without immediate scrutiny from supervisors. The psychological profile fits our evidence perfectly. Someone with mortuary administrative experience would naturally approach criminal activity with the same methodical attention to documentation and procedure that characterizes legitimate funeral operations. The careful timing of deliveries, the systematic use of masking agents, and the sophisticated misdirection campaign all align with someone trained in managing complex logistical operations. However, Holmes recognizes that identifying a likely suspect represents only the beginning of building a prosecutable case. Corbett's administrative skills that make him an ideal suspect also make him a formidable opponent in any attempt to gather concrete evidence of wrongdoing. A complex subplot emerges when Holmes discovers that Thomas Whitmore's disappearance intersects with a quiet inheritance battle surrounding Mrs. Ada Crowthorne's boarding house property. The building's ownership involves shares that became entangled with an informal will that Thomas had mentioned writing but never formally executed through proper legal channels. The inheritance complication reveals that Thomas possessed more financial resources than his modest clerk position would suggest. His late father had owned a small but profitable warehouse operation, and Thomas stood to inherit a substantial sum that would have resolved his money troubles permanently. However, the informal nature of the inheritance documents created opportunities for manipulation by those who understood legal procedures better than Thomas did. Holmes uncovers evidence that someone had been advising Thomas about accelerating his inheritance through questionable means. Messages passed between Thomas and an unknown party suggest he was being encouraged to take certain actions regarding his father's estate that would bypass normal probate procedures. These communications reveal subtle blackmail elements, pressure applied through knowledge of Thomas's financial desperation. The subplot connects to our main investigation through the timing and method of Thomas's disappearance. Someone needed him to vanish at a specific moment to prevent him from discovering irregularities in the inheritance handling, while simultaneously using his disappearance to create misdirection for the mortuary supply operation. The two crimes interlock with sophisticated precision. A significant institutional obstacle emerges when London's newspapers, led by the Times and the Daily Telegraph, splash sensational headlines about the Baker Street butcher across their front pages. The press coverage forces Inspector Lestrade to implement strict information controls, cutting off access to crime scenes, and limiting the sharing of evidence between official investigators and consulting detectives. The newspaper coverage creates a feeding frenzy of speculation that threatens to overwhelm factual investigation with sensationalized theories. Street ballad singers begin performing songs about the mysterious butcher, while penny dreadfuls promise serialized stories based on true events from Baker Street. The commercial exploitation of the case makes it nearly impossible to conduct interviews without attracting unwanted attention. Lestrade's clampdown on information flow raises the stakes considerably for Holmes's independent investigation. Official cooperation becomes limited to what Lestrade can provide without violating direct orders from his superiors, who now view the case as politically sensitive. The restriction forces Holmes to rely more heavily on his own observation and deduction, rather than police resources. The media attention also endangers witnesses and potential sources of information. People who might have been willing to speak privately about unusual activities in their neighborhoods now fear being quoted in newspapers or becoming subjects of public speculation. This chilling effect on witness cooperation significantly complicates the gathering of crucial evidence. A carefully planted red herring surfaces in the form of aggressive price flyers distributed throughout several London neighborhoods. The flyers advertise dramatically reduced meat prices from a rival butcher operating near Whitechapel, with promises of finest quality at half the usual cost. The timing and placement of these advertisements create a perfectly plausible alternative explanation for Thomas Whitmore's interest in discount meat supplies. Holmes initially pursues this lead with characteristic thoroughness, investigating the Whitechapel butcher's business practices and financial records. The shop appears to be engaged in exactly the kind of questionable supply arrangements that might attract customers willing to overlook the source of their bargains. Everything about the operation suggests legitimate motives for both advertising unusual prices and maintaining discretion about suppliers. However, deeper investigation reveals that the flyers themselves contain subtle inconsistencies in typography and paper quality that suggest they were produced by someone unfamiliar with the Whitechapel butcher's actual business practices. The distribution pattern, when mapped carefully, corresponds more closely to mortuary employee commute routes than to areas where the Whitechapel shop typically advertises. The red herring's sophistication demonstrates our antagonist's thorough understanding of how investigations typically proceed. By creating a plausible alternative explanation that requires significant time and resources to disprove, they gained additional days to consolidate their position and eliminate remaining evidence. The false lead also served to test whether Holmes would pursue obvious connections or dig deeper into contradictory details. Watson notes the psychological pressure that multiple false leads create on everyone involved in the investigation. Ada begins questioning her own memories and observations, while North becomes increasingly paranoid about being framed for crimes he cannot understand. Even Lestrade shows signs of losing confidence in his ability to distinguish genuine evidence from planted misdirection. The convergence of inheritance fraud, media manipulation, and systematic misdirection creates a multi-layered obstacle course that threatens to overwhelm traditional investigative methods. Holmes recognizes that solving this case requires not just identifying the perpetrator, but understanding the complete architecture of deception that surrounds the core crimes. Time pressure intensifies as each false lead consumes precious hours while the upcoming abattoir inspection approaches. The inspection will trigger widespread reorganization of inventory records throughout London's meat and mortuary industries, potentially erasing the last traces of evidence that might expose the operation's true scope and methods. If you're enjoying this investigation and want to see how Holmes untangles this complex web of deception, make sure you're subscribed to catch every twist and turn of this incredible case. The investigation reaches a deeply personal turning point when Nell Pike seeks protection at 221B Baker Street, arriving in the early evening hours with fear written across her face and desperation in her voice. She confesses to Holmes that she has been carrying messages between Mr. Corbett, the mortuary foreman, and an unknown buyer, but stops short of revealing specific names or the content of those communications. Nell's revelation provides the first direct human connection between our suspected mortuary operation and the broader network of accomplices required to execute such a sophisticated scheme. Her flower-selling position at the market provides perfect cover for passing messages throughout London's commercial districts, without arousing suspicion from authorities or competitors. The confession tears at Nell's conscience in ways that are painful to witness. She describes being approached initially with what seemed like innocent requests to deliver notes about flower arrangements for funeral services. The payments offered were generous enough to help her maintain her market stall during slow periods, and the work appeared completely legitimate. However, as time passed, Nell began noticing that the messages she carried had nothing to do with flowers or funeral arrangements. The recipients responded with packages wrapped in distinctive brown paper, sealed with that familiar teal wax, and scented with anise oil. She realized she was facilitating something far more sinister than decorative arrangements for memorial services. Nell's fear stems not just from her unwitting participation in criminal activity, but from direct threats made by Corbett when she expressed reluctance to continue carrying messages. He demonstrated knowledge of her personal circumstances, her sick mother, her precarious financial situation, her lack of other employment options, in ways that made clear he had been researching her vulnerabilities systematically. Holmes faces a profound moral dilemma in how to handle Nell's situation. Protecting her from further intimidation requires actions that might alert Corbett to the change in investigative focus, potentially allowing him to escape or destroy remaining evidence. However, failing to protect her puts an innocent woman at risk, while using her as unwitting bait for a dangerous criminal. The choice carries tactical implications that extend far beyond Nell's immediate safety. Holmes recognizes that Corbett's willingness to threaten witnesses directly indicates escalating desperation and decreasing concern about exposure. This suggests the criminal operation may be approaching its planned conclusion, making immediate action more urgent but also more dangerous. Watson advocates strongly for Nell's protection, drawing on his medical experience with patients who have suffered trauma from intimidation and threats. He points out that her psychological state shows signs of severe stress that could affect her reliability as a witness, even if her physical safety is ensured. The doctor's humanitarian instincts conflict with the detective's need for usable evidence. Holmes must weigh his professional obligation to solve the case against his moral duty to protect those who provide assistance to his investigation. The decision becomes more complex when he realizes that Nell possesses information crucial to understanding the full scope of the criminal network, but extracting that information safely requires time and trust that the current circumstances may not allow. The ghost of a previous mortuary scandal begins casting shadows over the current investigation when Holmes discovers records of unclaimed bodies that were mismanaged during a cholera outbreak 5 years earlier. The administrative failures during that crisis created opportunities for someone to establish irregular procedures that continue operating under cover of legitimate funeral industry activities. The historical context illuminates how Corbett might have gained both the knowledge and the cover needed to divert mortuary materials for profit. During the cholera crisis, normal oversight procedures were suspended to handle the volume of deaths, and emergency protocols allowed funeral industry workers unprecedented autonomy in managing remains and related supplies. Holmes realizes that what appears to be a recent criminal enterprise actually represents the continuation and expansion of irregular practices that began during a genuine public health emergency. The sophistication of the current operation reflects years of refinement and experience rather than a newly conceived scheme. The historical revelation also explains the perfect timing of various aspects of the case. Corbett's knowledge of administrative procedures, his access to supplies and facilities, and his network of contacts throughout London's funeral industry all developed during the legitimately chaotic circumstances of the cholera outbreak. He simply continued using emergency procedures after the emergency ended. Nell's involvement takes on new significance when viewed against this historical background. Her flower-selling business began during the same period, initially providing memorial arrangements for the increased number of funeral services. Her established relationships with funeral industry workers made her a natural choice when Corbett needed a discreet messenger service years later. The emotional weight of these revelations affects everyone involved in different ways. Ada realizes that Thomas's disappearance might be connected to historical crimes that predate his arrival in her boarding house. North understands that his business has been systematically infiltrated by someone with years of experience in manipulation and misdirection. Holmes accepts the moral debt that comes with endangering Nell through his investigation while recognizing that her cooperation may be essential to preventing future victims. The case has evolved beyond simple criminal detection into a complex web of historical injustice and contemporary exploitation that demands both intellectual solution and humanitarian response. Holmes pieces together the serialized clues that reveal the true scope and method of Corbett's operation, connecting three critical elements that form a consistent logistics pattern. The teal wax serves as both a practical sealing agent and an identification system, marking packages that belong to the irregular supply chain rather than legitimate funeral industry materials. Each piece of wax bears microscopic markings that indicate origin, destination, and handling instructions comprehensible only to those within the criminal network. The anise masking agents follow specific concentration patterns that indicate not just attempts to hide unpleasant odors, but sophisticated chemical knowledge applied to preservation and transport of organic materials under conditions that fall outside normal funeral industry procedures. Corbett's mastery of mortuary chemistry extends far beyond what his official position would require, suggesting extensive experimentation with techniques designed to maximize profit from materials that should remain within regulated channels. The post-dawn tram transfers represent the most elegant aspect of the operation, utilizing London's expanding public transportation system to move packages across the city while maintaining perfect legal cover. The timing aligns precisely with shift changes at multiple funeral establishments, creating windows of opportunity when materials can be diverted without immediate oversight from supervisors or regulatory authorities. Holmes maps these three elements across time and geography, revealing a network that spans dozens of locations throughout London and operates on schedules coordinated with remarkable precision. The sophistication suggests an operation that has been refined through years of practice rather than hastily conceived criminal activity. A shocking escalation arrives with the Morning Post when a new parcel appears at 221B Baker Street, this time containing only a stained apron tag bearing Thomas Whitmore's initials rather than any organic material. The psychological message is clear. The antagonist possesses detailed knowledge of our investigation's progress and feels confident enough to taunt Holmes directly while demonstrating continued access to evidence from the original crime. The apron tag itself provides crucial information about Thomas's final hours. The staining patterns indicate exposure to the same chemical processes used in mortuary preparation, while the fabric wear suggests Thomas was forced to participate in manual labor related to the criminal operation before his disappearance. The tag represents both a trophy and a threat, indicating that Corbett views the investigation as a personal challenge rather than a professional obstacle. This escalation without corresponding physical evidence demonstrates a criminal mindset that has moved beyond simple profit motivation into psychological territory, where the game itself becomes as important as the financial rewards. Corbett's willingness to directly provoke Holmes suggests either desperate confidence or dangerous instability in his mental state. The timeline pressure intensifies dramatically when the abattoir inspection schedule is moved up by several days due to sustained press coverage of the Butcher of Baker Street case. City officials respond to public concern by accelerating regulatory oversight of London's meat processing industry, creating an earlier deadline for any evidence that might remain within those facilities. However, Holmes recognizes that this acceleration might actually benefit Corbett's operation rather than threaten it. The rushed inspection schedule will focus attention on legitimate meat processing facilities while providing cover for any unusual activity within the funeral industry during the same period. Regulatory resources directed toward butcher shops cannot simultaneously monitor mortuary establishments. A charity ball scheduled at the mortuary's patron hall fixes a narrow window for surveillance operations, as the social event will require most funeral industry workers to maintain normal schedules while providing legitimate reasons for unusual activity around the facilities. The ball's timing aligns perfectly with the accelerated inspection schedule, creating multiple layers of misdirection that could allow Corbett to complete whatever final phase of his operation remains. Holmes realizes that the charity ball represents both maximum opportunity and maximum risk for direct confrontation. The social gathering will bring together everyone involved in London's funeral industry, potentially exposing accomplices who have remained hidden throughout the investigation. However, the same circumstances that make surveillance possible also provide perfect cover for eliminating witnesses or destroying evidence under the guise of legitimate preparation for the social event. The escalation reaches its peak when Nell Pike vanishes from her usual market position during her evening route. A brief note sealed with teal wax appears at 2:21 within hours, naming the specific hour when the charity ball's closing hymn will be performed. The message contains no explicit threats, but the implication is unmistakable. Nell's safety depends on actions taken during that precise time window. Corbett's ability to coordinate Nell's disappearance with the delivery of a precisely timed message demonstrates operational capabilities that extend far beyond what a single mortuary foreman could execute independently. The network of accomplices appears to include individuals with access to multiple communication channels and the ability to coordinate complex timing across London's extensive geography. Watson notes the psychological pressure that constant escalation places on everyone involved in the investigation. The shift from mysterious packages to direct threats creates an atmosphere where every decision carries potential consequences for innocent people who have become entangled in circumstances beyond their control or understanding. The case has evolved into a race against time where traditional investigative methods must compete with an adversary who demonstrates increasing boldness and decreasing concern about exposure. The inheritance struggle surrounding Mrs. Ada Crowthorne's boarding house and the money laundering scheme through awful sales begin revealing themselves as interconnected elements of a larger infrastructure designed to enable and conceal criminal activity. Thomas Whitmore's informal will, rather than representing a separate complication, was actually part of Corbett's long-term strategy for accessing legitimate financial channels through which irregular profits could be processed. Holmes discovers that Thomas had been advised to structure his inheritance in ways that would require temporary management by a trusted financial advisor, a role that Corbett had positioned himself to fill through carefully cultivated relationships within London's commercial community. The inheritance money would have provided both immediate capital for expanding the mortuary supply operation and legitimate financial history that could justify unexplained income from criminal activities. The boarding house property itself serves multiple functions within this criminal infrastructure. Ada's financial desperation made her vulnerable to manipulation, while the building's location provided perfect observation points for monitoring both police activities and potential competitors. The regular presence of tenants created natural cover for unusual deliveries and meetings that might otherwise attract attention from neighbors. Thomas's disappearance was timed to coincide with critical dates in the probate process, ensuring that the inheritance funds would remain in legal limbo, while Corbett consolidated control over related financial instruments. The complexity of Victorian inheritance law created opportunities for someone with administrative expertise to manipulate outcomes in ways that benefited criminal operations while appearing to result from bureaucratic confusion rather than deliberate fraud. The red herring involving the rival butcher's price flyers reveals itself through detailed investigation as a sophisticated misdirection campaign orchestrated by Corbett's network. The flyers were produced using paper and ink traceable to supplies commonly available to funeral industry administrative offices, while the distribution pattern corresponds precisely to areas frequented by mortuary workers during their off-duty hours. Holmes realizes that Corbett had been studying investigative methodologies, possibly through observation of previous police cases or through contacts within law enforcement agencies. The false leads were designed specifically to exploit typical police procedures, leading investigators through time-consuming verification processes, while the real criminal activity continued undisturbed. The misdirection campaign extends beyond simple false advertising to include planted evidence, coached witnesses, and manipulated business records that create internally consistent but entirely fictional narratives about criminal activity in the butcher trade. The sophistication suggests coordination between multiple accomplices with different areas of expertise and access to various legitimate institutions throughout London. Watson notes that the conversion of misdirection into logical understanding represents a crucial breakthrough in the investigative process. Rather than simply identifying false leads, Holmes has begun using the patterns within those false leads to understand the true operation structure and methods. The lies themselves become evidence that reveals the truth they were designed to conceal. Predictable routes, discreet hand signals at the Thames side wharf, and a hesitant accomplice in the tram depot create the foundation for a potential sting operation that could expose the entire network. Holmes maps the signal system used to coordinate package transfers, identifying specific timing sequences and location codes that allow the operation to function without direct verbal communication between accomplices. The tram depot accomplice appears to be the weakest link in Corbett's network, showing signs of nervousness and reluctance that suggest limited commitment to criminal activity. This person's involvement seems to stem from financial pressure rather than criminal ambition, creating opportunities for Holmes to apply leverage through offers of protection in exchange for cooperation. The wharf signals operate on a system that coordinates with tide schedules and commercial shipping traffic, indicating that the criminal operation extends beyond London's terrestrial boundaries into maritime commerce. Packages may be transferred to ships that carry them to other ports, either for disposal or for sale in markets where their origins cannot be traced back to London's funeral industry. Holmes recognizes that the bait strategy requires precise timing to avoid alerting the network to surveillance activities while ensuring that enough evidence can be gathered to support prosecution of all involved parties. The operation's complexity means that exposing one element without understanding the complete structure might allow other components to continue functioning under modified procedures. The hesitant accomplice at the tram depot represents both opportunity and risk for the sting operation. Their cooperation could provide access to crucial evidence and testimony, but their nervous behavior might also alert other network members to increased scrutiny. Holmes must balance the value of insider information against the risk of premature exposure. Dr. True. Watson's medical training proves valuable in assessing the psychological states of various accomplices and witnesses, helping Holmes understand which individuals might be turned into cooperative witnesses and which pose continuing threats to the investigation's success. The doctor's ability to recognize signs of genuine remorse versus calculated deception becomes crucial for evaluating potential allies. The convergence of multiple subplots creates momentum that drives the investigation toward its climactic phase, but also increases the number of variables that must be managed simultaneously. Each revelation adds both clarity about the criminal network structure and complexity to the challenge of dismantling it safely and completely. Holmes synthesizes months of careful observation and deduction into a comprehensive hypothesis that explains every element of Corbett's sophisticated criminal enterprise. The mortuary foreman has created a systematic method for diverting human remains and related materials through official funeral industry channels, processing them through chemical treatments that render them suitable for sale as discount meat products to unsuspecting consumers throughout London. The operation exploits several vulnerabilities within Victorian London's regulatory system. Funeral parlors operate under different oversight than butcher shops, creating jurisdictional gaps that allow materials to move between industries without comprehensive tracking. The urban population's growth has overwhelmed existing inspection capabilities, while the complexity of chemical processing makes detection difficult for officials without specialized technical knowledge. Corbett's mortuary chemistry expertise enables him to use preservation and masking agents that eliminate obvious signs of the material's true origin while maintaining their commercial value as food products. The anise oil masks organic decay scents, while specific chemical treatments modify tissue composition, enough to pass casual inspection by customers focused primarily on price rather than quality indicators. The financial structure involves multiple layers of legitimate transactions that conceal the criminal profits within normal business operations. Corbett sells processed materials to accomplices who operate seemingly independent butcher shops, which then market the products as discount offerings to price-conscious consumers. The inheritance fraud provides capital for expanding operations while creating legitimate financial histories that justify unexplained income. The motive combines economic desperation with administrative pride, as Corbett's position provides technical knowledge and access but insufficient compensation for his expertise and responsibilities. His systematic approach reflects someone who views the criminal operation as a logical extension of his professional capabilities rather than a fundamental departure from legitimate work. The means include access to mortuary facilities during off hours, knowledge of chemical processing techniques, authority to sign transfer documents, and established relationships with suppliers and customers throughout London's commercial network. Corbett's administrative position provides perfect cover for coordinating complex logistics while maintaining official documentation that appears completely legitimate. The opportunity arose during the cholera outbreak's administrative chaos, when emergency procedures suspended normal oversight and allowed funeral industry workers unprecedented autonomy. Corbett refined his methods during this period of reduced scrutiny, then continued operating under emergency protocols long after the emergency ended, gradually expanding the operation's scope and sophistication. The timeline urgency reflects Corbett's recognition that increased police attention and pending regulatory changes threaten to expose irregularities that have operated successfully for years. The abattoir inspection represents a deadline for completing whatever final phase remains, possibly involving disposal of remaining evidence or elimination of witnesses who could provide testimony about historical criminal activities. A crucial slip occurs when Holmes notices that Corbett has overcorrected a ledger date, leaving a fresh ink ridge that contradicts the document's established dusting patterns. This microscopic evidence indicates recent alteration of supposedly historical records, suggesting ongoing efforts to eliminate traces of criminal activity from official documentation maintained at multiple funeral establishments. The ink analysis reveals specific chemical composition consistent with administrative supplies used exclusively within funeral industry offices, while the correction pattern suggests someone familiar with mortuary record-keeping procedures attempting to modify entries retroactively. The alteration timing corresponds with periods when Holmes's investigation approached discoveries that might have led directly to mortuary industry scrutiny. Maximum risk materializes when Nell Pike's disappearance coincides with delivery of a note bearing teal wax seals and naming the specific hour when the charity ball's closing hymn will be performed. The message implies that Nell's safety depends on actions taken during that precise time window, creating a direct confrontation between Holmes's investigation and Corbett's willingness to use violence against innocent witnesses. The note itself demonstrates Corbett's continued access to high-quality funeral industry supplies and his confidence in his ability to operate under increased scrutiny. The precision timing suggests coordination with multiple accomplices who monitor various aspects of London's social and commercial activities to identify optimal moments for criminal actions. Nell's disappearance represents escalation from property crimes and fraud into kidnapping and potential murder, indicating that Corbett views the investigation as an existential threat requiring extreme measures. Her knowledge of the message-carrying network makes her both a valuable witness for prosecution and a dangerous liability from Corbett's perspective. The charity ball setting creates maximum complexity for any rescue or surveillance operation, as the social event brings together London's funeral industry professionals in circumstances where unusual behavior might be attributed to legitimate preparation activities rather than criminal coordination. The formal atmosphere provides perfect cover for meetings and transactions that would appear suspicious in other contexts. Holmes realizes that the critical point has arrived where traditional investigative methods must give way to direct action. The evidence collected provides sufficient understanding of Corbett's methods and network to support prosecution, but Nell's safety requires intervention before the legal system can protect her through normal processes. The convergence of multiple timelines, the charity ball, the abattoir inspection, and Nell's endangerment, creates a narrow window where decisive action might simultaneously expose the criminal network, gather prosecutable evidence, and protect innocent victims from further harm. The conditions align perfectly for executing the carefully planned bait operation as evening fog pools over the London Mews, creating natural concealment for surveillance activities while the charity ball's formal schedule provides predictable timing markers. Church bell chimes mask the sounds of movement through narrow alleys, while the fixed timetable defined by the ball's closing hymn ensures that all parties operate within precisely defined temporal boundaries. Holmes coordinates team responsibilities with military precision, assigning Dr. Watson to monitor the tram depot where the hesitant accomplice maintains the transportation link crucial to Corbett's operation. Watson's medical training makes him ideal for assessing whether witnesses show signs of genuine cooperation or potential betrayal, while his steady nerves under pressure ensure reliable observation during critical moments. Inspector Lestrade receives instructions to provoke Corbett through a deliberately conspicuous fake warrant call at the funeral establishment, creating apparent official pressure that should force accelerated criminal activity, while providing legal cover for increased police presence in the area. The false warrant contains carefully crafted details designed to test Corbett's reactions and reveal information about network operations. Holmes positions himself to document seal swaps and package transfers directly, using his keen observational skills to record evidence that will support prosecution while maintaining enough distance to avoid premature confrontation. His enhanced senses detect the subtle differences between wet leather, coal smoke, and the sharp bite of disinfectant that characterize different phases of the criminal operation. The bait execution requires split-second timing, as Corbett begins operating with his signature methodical precision. The teal wax seals are applied according to established patterns that indicate specific destinations and handling procedures, while anise oil applications follow concentration formulas refined through years of experience with masking organic decay odors. The tram handoff system reveals itself through direct observation, as packages move through London's public transportation network under cover of legitimate passenger traffic. The timing coordination demonstrates sophisticated understanding of schedule variations and personnel rotations that allow materials to transfer between different areas of the city without detection by transportation authorities or casual observers. Corbett demonstrates his methodical nature through the precise application of preservation chemicals and the systematic documentation of each transaction in coded ledger entries that appear legitimate to superficial inspection but contain information crucial for coordinating network operations. His movements show the confidence of someone operating within established routines rather than improvising under pressure. The unforeseen complications arise when a tram brake squall creates unexpected noise that threatens to alert Corbett to surveillance activities, followed by a brief power disruption that temporarily darkens the critical observation area just as the most important package transfers begin occurring. These mechanical failures force Holmes to adapt his documentation strategy while maintaining visual contact with criminal activities. A wavering accomplice at the depot shows signs of losing nerve, hesitating during crucial handoff moments in ways that could expose the entire operation to discovery by legitimate transportation officials. Holmes must decide whether to intervene to prevent exposure or allow events to unfold naturally, while risking the loss of crucial evidence. The momentum teeters between near capture and near failure as the bait parcel moves through the established network with Corbett remaining unaware of surveillance. But technical difficulties and human nervousness threaten to disrupt the carefully orchestrated plan at the moment when success appears most achievable. Holmes improvises a reroute strategy, switching prepared parcels and marking the teal wax with microscopic scratches that will provide definitive proof of tampering while allowing the criminal operation to proceed according to Corbett's expectations. This modification requires split-second timing and perfect manual dexterity, under conditions of limited visibility and extreme time pressure. The preparation reaches its climactic moment as the charity ball's closing hymn begins echoing through the London evening, signaling the predetermined time when all network operations must conclude according to Corbett's established protocols. The parcel containing the marked evidence rests beneath the mortuary hatch with Corbett's hand positioned to make the final seal that will complete his criminal transaction, while simultaneously providing the evidence needed for his arrest and prosecution. The alternation between near capture and near failure reaches its peak intensity as the bait parcel moves through Corbett's network with agonizing precision, each handoff bringing the investigation closer to definitive proof, while simultaneously risking exposure that could destroy months of careful preparation. The accomplice at the tram depot shows increasing signs of nervousness, glancing repeatedly over his shoulder and fumbling with packages in ways that attract unwanted attention from legitimate passengers. Holmes observes from his concealed position as Corbett approaches the critical moment, the mortuary foreman's methodical nature evident in every careful movement as he prepares to apply the final teal wax seal. The fog provides perfect concealment for surveillance while creating atmospheric conditions that could either aid or hinder the precise timing required for successful evidence collection. The wavering accomplice's hesitation threatens to unravel the entire operation when he nearly drops a crucial package during transfer, catching it just before it strikes the platform in a way that would have alerted nearby transportation officials to unusual activity during off-peak hours. His recovery appears smooth to casual observers, but Holmes recognizes the signs of someone operating beyond his comfort level with criminal activity. Dr. Watson maintains his position at the depot, using his medical training to assess the psychological state of various participants while documenting the precise timing and sequence of package transfers. His steady presence provides reassurance to the nervous accomplice while ensuring that crucial evidence collection continues despite mounting tension throughout the network. Inspector Lestrade's fake warrant provocation succeeds in creating apparent official pressure without triggering premature flight responses from network members. Corbett's reaction reveals both his confidence in his cover story and his detailed knowledge of police procedures, as he responds to official inquiry with precisely the right combination of cooperation and indignation expected from a legitimate funeral industry professional. The momentum shifts dramatically when a second tram experiences mechanical difficulties, forcing an unscheduled route change that requires rapid adaptation of the handoff sequence. Corbett demonstrates his operational expertise by smoothly implementing backup procedures that maintain the network's functionality while revealing the extent of contingency planning built into his criminal enterprise. Holmes recognizes that this moment of adaptation provides the perfect opportunity to observe Corbett's decision-making process under pressure, revealing personality traits and operational priorities that confirm psychological profiles developed throughout the investigation. The mortuary foreman's ability to maintain composure while implementing complex backup procedures demonstrates both criminal sophistication and professional competence. The near failure occurs when fog density increases beyond anticipated levels, temporarily obscuring visual surveillance just as Corbett begins the final phase of package preparation. Holmes must rely on sound patterns and indirect observation to track criminal activity during the most crucial moments, creating uncertainty about whether sufficient evidence is being collected to support prosecution. The unforeseen variable emerges when Nell Pike's voice can be heard from within the mortuary building, indicating that she remains alive but may be positioned where rescue attempts could trigger violent responses from Corbett or his accomplices. Her presence adds human stakes to the evidence collection operation, forcing Holmes to balance prosecutorial objectives against immediate humanitarian concerns. The accomplice's wavering reaches crisis point when he begins showing signs of complete panic, his movements becoming erratic enough to attract attention from legitimate depot personnel who might intervene with questions or assistance that would expose the criminal operation. Watson subtly positions himself to provide intervention if necessary, while maintaining his surveillance responsibilities. The power disruption that temporarily darkened the observation area now works in Holmes's favor, as restored lighting creates stark shadows that enhance his ability to document Corbett's movements and the specific techniques used for applying teal wax seals. The contrast allows photographic quality observation of criminal methods that will support detailed testimony in legal proceedings. Corbett's hand moves toward the final package with practiced precision, his confidence evident in the steady application of pressure needed to create proper seals while maintaining the chemical integrity of preservation treatments. His technique reveals years of experience with both legitimate funeral procedures and their criminal adaptations. The moment before denouement crystallizes as multiple elements converge simultaneously. The marked package bearing microscopic evidence scratches, Corbett's hand applying the incriminating seal, Nell's safety hanging in balance, the accomplice network operating at maximum exposure, and Holmes poised to signal coordinated action that will either capture definitive proof of criminal activity or alert the entire network to surveillance and prosecution efforts. The Charity Ball's closing hymn provides acoustic cover for final positioning as each participant in both criminal and investigative operations moves toward predetermined positions. The timing synchronization demonstrates the sophisticated coordination required for complex operations while creating maximum tension about whether law enforcement capabilities can match criminal organizational skills. The cut to the brink leaves the investigation balanced on the edge between complete success and catastrophic failure, with Nell Pike's life, months of investigative work, and London's safety from continued criminal exploitation all dependent on actions taken in the next crucial seconds. The constructed flagrante delicto unfolds with mathematical precision as physical evidence aligns in an unbreakable chain of proof that connects every element of Corbett's criminal enterprise. The mismatched wax reveals itself under Holmes's magnifying examination, showing microscopic inconsistencies between legitimate funeral seals and the criminal adaptations used for package identification. The distinctive anise threading provides chemical fingerprint evidence that links mortuary supplies directly to meat processing applications through concentration patterns impossible to achieve through legitimate business channels. The recorded seal swap demonstrates Corbett's systematic method in real time, captured through careful documentation that shows his hand applying teal wax according to established criminal protocols while believing himself unobserved. The evidence creates an unbreakable chain-linking method, means, and movement in a causal sequence that eliminates any possibility of coincidence or misinterpretation. Holmes observes the fatal flaw revealing itself through Corbett's own actions rather than external pressure or confrontation. The mortuary foreman's administrative pride, the very trait that enabled his criminal success through meticulous record-keeping and systematic procedures, compels him to make one final ledger adjustment under direct surveillance. His need to maintain immaculate documentation overrides caution, exposing him definitively without requiring dramatic speechifying or forced confession. The ledger correction occurs with Corbett unaware that his movements are being observed and recorded, his concentration focused entirely on ensuring that his records maintain the internal consistency that has protected his operation for years. The fresh ink application creates physical evidence of document tampering that can be scientifically analyzed and legally presented without relying on witness testimony or interpretive argument. Dr. Watson documents the precise moment when Corbett's hand moves across the ledger page, his medical training allowing him to note the physical characteristics of someone engaged in deceptive behavior while maintaining emotional control under extreme pressure. The doctor's observations provide psychological evidence that complements the physical proof collected through direct surveillance. Inspector Lestrade coordinates the arrest sequence with military precision, moving into position only after sufficient evidence has been collected to ensure successful prosecution. His timing prevents any opportunity for evidence destruction while minimizing risk to Nell Pike and other potential victims who remain within Corbett's reach during the final confrontation. The emotional answer emerges not just through identifying who committed the crimes and how they were executed, but through understanding the human cost of Corbett's systematic exploitation of London's most vulnerable citizens. Nell's fear resulted from months of manipulation by someone who understood her economic desperation and used it to force participation in criminal activity against her moral instincts. Ada Crowthorne's guilt stems from her realization that financial desperation made her vulnerable to manipulation and led her to make accusations against innocent people while the real criminal operated with impunity. Her boarding house provided infrastructure that enabled criminal operations while she remained unaware of how her legitimate business was being exploited. Levi North's reputation suffered damage that cannot be completely repaired even after his exoneration, as suspicions once planted in community minds tend to persist despite official vindication. His experience demonstrates how criminal operations create victims beyond their direct targets by manipulating social dynamics and commercial relationships. Inspector Lestrade's professional trust became strained through systematic misdirection that made police resources serve criminal objectives while creating public pressure that forced premature actions and inappropriate resource allocation. The investigation revealed vulnerabilities in law enforcement procedures that could be exploited by sophisticated criminal minds. Holmes acknowledges his own moral debt to witnesses he endangered through the investigation process, particularly Nell Pike, whose cooperation provided crucial evidence while exposing her to personal risk that extended far beyond her original involvement as an unwitting messenger. His success in solving the case carries responsibility for protecting those who made that success possible. The resolution provides justice through legal channels, while acknowledging that some forms of damage cannot be completely repaired through prosecutorial success. The systematic nature of Corbett's crimes created ripple effects throughout London's commercial and social networks that will require ongoing attention to address completely. Nell Pike's rescue occurs simultaneously with evidence collection, ensuring her physical safety while preserving her value as a witness in legal proceedings. Her testimony will provide crucial insider perspective on how the criminal network operated and recruited accomplices. But her psychological recovery will require extensive support beyond the investigation's conclusion. The mortuary operations exposure leads to regulatory changes that prevent similar exploitation of jurisdictional gaps between funeral and food industries, but also creates new administrative burdens for legitimate businesses operating in both sectors. The solution addresses systemic vulnerabilities while creating new compliance challenges for honest operators. Corbett's arrest occurs without violence or dramatic confrontation, his capture resulting from patient investigation and careful evidence collection rather than heroic action or fortunate accident. The methodical approach ensures that prosecution can proceed based on documented proof rather than dramatic testimony or circumstantial argument, increasing the likelihood of successful legal resolution. The legal consequences unfold systematically as charges are filed against Corbett and his network of accomplices, with evidence collected through months of careful investigation supporting prosecution on multiple counts including fraud, conspiracy, illegal disposal of human remains, and food safety violations. The comprehensive nature of the case requires coordination between multiple jurisdictions and regulatory bodies, but the documented proof eliminates most opportunities for legal maneuvering or plea bargaining that might reduce appropriate penalties. The mortuary establishment's operating license faces suspension pending a complete investigation of procedures and oversight failures that enabled criminal activity to continue undetected for years. Whitmore and Associates Funeral Services must demonstrate complete cooperation with authorities and implementation of new safeguards before resuming operations, while industry-wide regulatory changes address systemic vulnerabilities that allowed such exploitation to occur. Mrs. Ada Crowthorne's boarding house stabilizes under increased scrutiny as the inheritance complications surrounding Thomas Whitmore's estate are resolved through proper legal channels. The publicity surrounding the case initially threatens her reputation and business prospects, but community understanding of her unwitting victimization gradually restores confidence in her establishment's respectability and security. Levi North receives quiet official exoneration through police statements and newspaper corrections, but the full restoration of his public reputation requires time and continued demonstration of his business integrity. Some customers return immediately upon learning of his innocence, while others remain influenced by initial suspicions, despite factual evidence of his complete non-involvement in criminal activities. The silences that persist reflect social and psychological damage that cannot be completely repaired through legal resolution. Nell Pike's experience with manipulation and intimidation creates lasting wariness about trusting others, while her knowledge of how easily ordinary citizens can become entangled in criminal activities affects her willingness to engage in community relationships that might involve any element of risk. The resignified plant appears when the lone meat hook from the original mysterious package returns as a paperweight on Holmes's desk at 221B Baker Street, its tally notch serving as a permanent reminder of arithmetic performed with human lives rather than simple commercial transactions. The transformation from sinister threat to contemplative symbol reflects Holmes's recognition that each case involves real human costs that extend beyond intellectual puzzle solving. The meat hook's presence provides daily reminder that successful detection carries moral obligations to those affected by both criminal activity and investigative procedures. Its weight against papers and documents symbolizes the gravity of decisions made during investigations that affect innocent people's lives, livelihoods, and sense of security within their communities. The small human question that lingers centers on what becomes of those whom London's rapid urban growth counts as surplus population. People whose disappearances might not be noticed or investigated, if not for coincidental connection to more prominent citizens. Thomas Whitmore's fate illustrates how economic desperation creates vulnerability to exploitation by those who view human beings as disposable resources. The ethical whisper speaks to systemic issues that extend beyond individual criminal cases to encompass social policies and economic structures that create conditions where sophisticated exploitation becomes possible. Corbett's operation succeeded partly because London's administrative complexity and rapid population growth created gaps where people could disappear without immediate official attention. Holmes reflects on the investigation's broader implications for understanding how criminal enterprises adapt to exploit legitimate institutional structures and social relationships. The case demonstrates that sophisticated criminals often succeed not by operating outside established systems, but by understanding those systems well enough to manipulate them for illegal purposes while maintaining facades of complete legitimacy. The resolution provides closure for the immediate criminal activity, while raising larger questions about urban development, regulatory oversight, and social responsibility for protecting vulnerable populations. The technical success of the investigation contrasts with ongoing systemic challenges that create conditions enabling similar future exploitation. Dr. Watson documents the long-term effects on all participants as they attempt to resume normal lives after exposure to criminal manipulation and investigative scrutiny. The psychological impact of learning how easily trust can be exploited and legitimate activities can serve criminal purposes affects everyone differently, but creates lasting changes in how they assess risk and evaluate relationships. The case file joins Holmes's collection as both a record of successful detection and a study in the human costs of criminal activity that extends far beyond direct victims to encompass entire communities. The documentation serves future reference for similar cases while preserving lessons learned about balancing investigative effectiveness with humanitarian responsibility. This incredible case shows us how the greatest detective mind of all time unraveled one of London's most sophisticated criminal operations through pure deduction and careful observation. If you want to see more amazing Sherlock Holmes investigations like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another mind-bending mystery. And let me know in the comments below, what was the clue that convinced you Holmes was on the right track? I'd love to hear your detective theories. Until next time, the game is always afoot. For a fully dramatized screenplay version of this investigation, or to submit the next mysterious title for Holmes to investigate, the adventure continues with each new case that challenges the limits of deductive reasoning and human understanding.